Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Ronin Leadership Podcast. This is Mike Howard. It's a beautiful but hot Monday morning here in Las Vegas. We hit about 117 yesterday, but I guess we moved to the desert for heat and sun, so we got both. But anyway, I trust all of you had a great weekend, and thank all of you for subscribing to the podcast. Our subscribership is growing weekly. Thank you for that. Please hit the subscribe button and the like button. Please tell your friends and family, and as I always joke, sometimes your enemies, because they may need to know something about leadership, hopefully. And thank you also for supporting the books, especially the last one, Full Circle, which has gotten a lot of great reviews. And I'm writing a sequel now as we speak. So try to get more into the fiction genre. So get the shameless plugs out of the way so we can get on with the main event here. So years ago, I was blessed to meet a person named Kari. Is that the right way to say it? After all these years,
All right, Carrie, I answered all of
whatever.
it.
Answered all. Guitar. And if you recognize the name, it also is synonymous with a certain brand of chocolate, which is very delicious. But I was blessed to meet her because I was asked to speak at the Holt International Business School in San Francisco when I was still Chief Security Officer at Microsoft. And I remember we went there and I had a great session with you, obviously, and the students, but it was just interesting to see how you interacted with the students, and we can talk more about later how you motivate them in certain ways, to answer questions and stuff like that. But it was a wonderful experience, and we became really good friends. And over the years, we kept in contact. And Kari's had a long, distinguished career, which is still ongoing. And I'll let her talk about that. But it broaches both academia and the private sector. She knows about business. She knows about leadership, and this podcast is about both. And so, welcome to the podcast, Kari, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day. Love the scenery behind you. I'm jealous.
Thanks, Mike. It's so great to be with you. This is super fun. Yeah, it's a hot 65 degrees here in the Bay Area. So I've got my cashmere sweater on just in case. I was working out though at 5 a.m. this morning. So that's when it was a little bit chilly. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
so great to be with you.
Yeah, no, this is wonderful. I was looking forward to this. It's been a while, and again, thanks. I know you've got a lot of stuff going on, so thanks. I guess I always like to get started by giving the audience a sense of who you are. So tell us a little bit about your background, your academic journey, business journey, and sort of, how you got to where you are right now, sitting and where you are.
Sure. So I think my background has been a little bit of everything, very similar to yours. I think that's why I felt like we had known each other forever when we met.
Right.
But I had an unusual start to my career because I actually straight out of grad school went into cybersecurity at the State Department, working in diplomatic security. And that was right at the tail end of the Clinton administration. So I had the opportunity to work with Dick Clark, who was at the NSC, just starting up a nascent cybersecurity focus. And
well.
yeah, and a total character. Talk about larger than life.
Yeah.
And I was a full-time like FTE employee of the government, which was great because when you're FTE, they can't fire you for disagreeing. And I always like to say I was one of the first Texans that invaded. So I grew up in Dallas, born and raised. And, I went there before the Bush administration, and we had, all the new appointees come in. And so that was really an amazing snapshot in time because we had Y2K. And then quickly when Secretary Powell came in, I had been leading red teams all over the Middle East. So we were doing cybersecurity assessments, a ton of briefings, things like that. And I was asked to brief Secretary Powell and Deputy Secretary Armitage, which was really kind of a turning point for me in a number of ways. But my dad is a fighter pilot in the Marine Corps, or was. And so, when I think of people that I just deeply admire, and want to go fangirl on. I mean, Colin Powell is one of those. There's just
Right.
no, and I remember that day too, because I got the call. They asked you to brief Secretary Powell, and you have 15 minutes to get ready. And it was the one day I didn't wear a suit. I was so mad at myself because I mean, you've seen me too. I mean, this is unusual. This is very summer for me, but I'm almost always in a suit.
Yeah.
And, and Armitage himself is another just larger than life figure. And so they were quite intimidating, but I had just come back from the Middle East, and so I was briefing them, and it was just an amazing, incredible moment with them. And it was during that time that Secretary Powell actually said, I think you need to go into public diplomacy and work for this woman I'm bringing in from Madison Avenue, Charlotte Beers. I knew nothing about advertising, nothing about Charlotte,
Wow.
but he had served on a couple corporate boards with Charlotte. And she's the first woman to ever be on the cover of Forbes and Fortune, 3-time CEO, global advertising CEO of top 10 advertising firms. So just, another larger than life personality. And I briefed her subsequently about a week later. And then the next thing I know, I get the call to come work with them. And so it was just, and then 9/11 happened. So all these forces, right, were coming together.
Wow.
And 9/11 for me, and I think for a lot of people at that time, especially peers of mine who were starting their careers, even in Madison Avenue and on Wall Street, it really forced a lot of us to rethink how we look at our careers and work. And it certainly gave us a very acute window into leadership and crisis. Like, I think crisis is the ultimate litmus test, right, for leaders.
Yep.
And you
Yep.
see it all. And you see leaders emerge out of nowhere, and then you see leaders just completely fall apart, like more formal, structured leadership. So that was a really fascinating crucible for my career as well, because all of these forces kind of came together, and suddenly I'm launched into this public diplomacy sphere. And also, it was my first sense of working with the private sector, and not just the private sector, but CEOs and chief marketing officers of some of the most iconic American brands from around the world. And that was fascinating because these are creative leaders. And so there are two types of leaders I've spent most of my career in the orbit of. And it's not been intentional. It's just, I don't know if it's the universe telling me you need to be around these people, but they're chief security officers like you, people in security that are leading those moments of crisis and uncertainty and challenge. And then these creative leaders, advertising, marketing, branding, PR, the communicators, the really, unusual nonlinear thinkers. And so it's been fascinating to see the two different types of leaders and to be able to work with them and learn from them, and blend kind of the two disciplines. But Charlotte was and is an extraordinary leader, incredibly tough on me. I mean, she was brutal on me, and she was like, I was tough on you because I wanted to make you better. But one of the things that I really appreciated was early on the listening efforts. And this is something that I find as a hallmark of every great leader, is the listening. And I saw it too with Secretary Powell. And it didn't matter what your rank was. It was who's been on the ground in the Middle East, who has a sense of the populations we want to engage, and just share with us, right? And so that active listening and trying to get as much intelligence as possible, and just really showing, empathy in those moments of bringing all this. Because I was 21 when I went to the State Department, so just a baby,
Amazing.
and yeah. So that was really kind of the foundation for my career. And it's always been a part of my career because when Secretary Powell was due to resign and Charlotte, they both left within about a year. And I was due to go to the Green Zone. I was ready to go to Iraq. I was,
trained up and ready to rock and roll.
I was trained up. I had all of my friends were going there, and that's just where I thought my career was going to go. And then I was set up on a blind date with this 5th generation chocolate maker from San Francisco. And next thing you know, and we've been married this year, it'll be 20 years. But that's why I live on the West Coast. So it was it was one of those moments again where I think in the post 9/11 context, and I think people have that today with the post COVID context, it's like, you know what, life is really, really short, and both my husband and I had lost parents at the age of 46. His dad died at 46 of a heart attack. My mom, a brain tumor at 46. So we kind of had that, this is it, right? And let's just go for it and see how this works out. And by the way, I'm allergic to chocolate. So I was not seduced by the chocolate whatsoever, but he was rather handsome. He still is. And so so here I was moving to the West Coast. And the other thing I appreciate about great leaders that I've had the opportunity to work with is that they're always lifelong learners. They never stop learning.
Yep.
And so my default, whenever I'm not sure what the next step is, and I'm a step A, B, C, I always have like 3 different plans ready to go, is I go back to school. So I was applying to doctoral programs because I knew I was moving to the West Coast. I wasn't sure what that next step was going to be. And it was, again, another dear friend who said, hey, there's this advertising. The 4As are doing a behind the scenes day for some senior Hill staffers. Why don't you go to New York? You'll love it. It's a free weekend. And I was like, I'm not going into advertising. I don't have a background in that. And he said, just go. It'll be a great meal, if anything else. And so I went to New York that weekend. This was 2 weeks before I was due to leave the State Department officially. And it was DDB worldwide. And they were having a behind the scenes day. And so I was there with like Nancy Pelosi's chief of staff. I mean, all the senior Hill leadership, their senior staffers were there, and me. And so, of course, it was awesome because you had all these DDB global CEOs coming in. I mean, DDB is an amazing organization. They have 100 and I don't know now if it's 110 offices around the world, probably more, but just very global, dynamic, creative thinking, right? And even Spike Lee at the time was running Spike DDB. So it was just no shortage of just cool, awesome people. So of course, everybody wants to be in advertising after you get one presentation after the other that just blows you out of the water. Right. Well, at lunch, it was funny because they said, we have a surprise guest. If you don't mind, our chairman, Keith Reinhard, would like to come in and give you a briefing about this idea he has for a task force of American companies. So we're like, sure, whatever. And we're having lunch, and Keith walks in, and he's very unassuming. He's just such a quiet, gentle spirit, and yet he commands attention. And he comes in and just very humble, very kind. And he's like, well, I really feel, because DDB at the time was representing a number of very iconic American brands. And he said, look, these companies are under fire because of what's because of what's happening, especially the US and the Middle East, and, our concerns about terrorist activity, but also anti-American sentiment was at that point the highest it had ever been. And he said, so I have this idea to start a task force, and I'm calling it Brand America. And I'm giving this presentation at the University of Texas next week. Can I just bounce it off of you and see what you think? So once again, demonstrating humility, demonstrating active listening, wanting to engage a very different audience than what he normally is surrounded by. Now, mind you, I knew nothing about Keith at this point. And he's a legend in the advertising. I mean, in space. I mean, he's like one of the top, like Charlotte, one of the top 100 creative thinkers of the last century. And he gave this presentation, and I had what I can only describe as an out-of-body experience. Every part of me was drawn to what he was saying, because he was like, look, companies have to band together to build bridges for America with the world, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. And we have to do it separate from government, separate from political activities. And business is well positioned to solve a lot of these complex problems that are occurring and, in different industries and this, that, and the other. And we can accelerate impact as opposed to the government. And so I was just so inspired by that I broke out in hives, which I do. I just get bright red, and I was like, that's the best idea I've ever heard. And it's amazing. And all these Hill staffers are like, what has she been drinking? I had not been drinking.
Yeah. What's wrong with her?
Yeah, right. But I was just like, yes, just every part of me, when you meet somebody and you just like, I would work for you. I will find a way to support what you're doing. I mean, he had that kind of an impact on us. And so we, lunch is over, and he goes back to his office, and we go about our day, and I don't think about it again. And then about 2 hours later, I get a tap on my shoulder, and they said, the chairman wants to see you. And I go up to this office on Madison Avenue. It was a corner office, stunning views, right? I mean, just as intimidating as you can possibly imagine. And he said, I got the sense you liked my idea. And I said,
How could you
yeah,
tell from my bright red
how could you
highs and everything,
tell?
huh?
I was practically levitating out of my seat. And he's like, well, I know you're supposed to go to this really awesome dinner tonight, but would you consider not going to the dinner and instead writing down your thoughts on what you would do with this if you helped me kind of build this out just to see what it might be like? And I said, done. I will do that. So that night I wrote a 5-page letter, which I'm still embarrassed about at this point because I don't write 5-page memos about anything anymore. And I haven't for a long time. But I just poured out my heart about this is how I would do it. And this is how, and he said, I want you to come back to New York in a week. And so a week later, he said, I reviewed your memo and I want to hire you to work for me to see if we can build this. And I'll hire you for 3 months. See what you can do. That was literally the brief. And he goes, you can work out of the DDB offices in San Francisco. That's 3 months. And what are your salary requirements? I mean, and here I was a government employee. I'm like,
Yeah, right. You don't
I've
know.
never been in negotiation like this, and I'm just like,
Right.
but this was a moment where I would have worked for this man for free. I mean, that was not even in my, frame of mind. And so I ended up working with him for almost 10 years. And it was the coolest professional experience I've ever had and his nickname for me was the unguided missile because I was charged with, which he said with love and affection, but you could take it both ways. I've had other people go,
Right.
that's not a compliment, but I love it because he's like, look, it may not make sense why Carrie's doing something, but she's going to get to where she's supposed to go. It's just not going to be a linear kind of, she's going to find
Well,
different.
there's a level of trust when he calls you that, right? Obviously.
Totally. But
Yeah.
CFOs, like the DDB's global CFO, which was, paying our bills, he was
Yeah.
like, I do not like the unguided missile carry. And I remember him having that conversation with him. He's like, you need to be a little bit more guided for me. So anyway, it was, but it was so fun because we built a corporate board and from scratch. And so this was before people were talking about purpose, before people were talking about social impact. We defined the space of corporate diplomacy. It didn't exist back then. I mean, you had companies like the one you worked with, Microsoft, who had their government affairs office in DC. And it was just,
Right.
It was out of sight, out of mind. And so I was just collecting people who were passionate about this, but I also got to work with leaders. So it was all relationships with the CEO. So the CEOs handpicked, either they were on the board or they handpicked who was going to represent their company on the board. So I, once again, had a really unusual window into leadership and very different kinds of leadership, so the first founding 7 members of this organization, which ended up becoming Business for Diplomatic Action, they were all advertising, global marketing, and PR CEOs. So they then engaged the brands. And then we covered every industry from there. And so it was a mix of just extraordinary leadership, all very global, all really wanting to do this right, putting their egos aside. I mean, you had advertising CEOs who were direct competitors working together. And they weren't being assholes about it. I mean, that's the thing I appreciate because, media always amplifies the assholes. And what I got, just a tremendous appreciation for was how much just humility there was in the room and what can we figure out? And it wasn't about the posturing or the egos and all of that. And so we developed a number of amazing partnerships with even competitor companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi. We launched a huge clean water initiative in Latin America. And then, so there were a number of ways where we started building what I still do to this day, which is strategic alliances. So companies finding very unusual and powerful alliances for them that can help them engage in social impact that will help them resist the blowback from either politically toxic issues or, for example, right now, you have a massively well-funded, coordinated anti-woke effort here in the United States. One of them is founded and headquartered out of Boston, and we can talk about that a bit more. But so any company that's engaging in DE&I right now or ESG is being targeted as being woke. So I started developing this space of, okay, who can we align with whether it's NGOs, sometimes it was governments, sometimes it was local governments. And then this was a global effort. So we're working with global governments, government bodies, NGOs. How many different alliances can we build to shield us so that we can continue the work that matters on the ground, drive impact, but also not get dragged into some of those, just politically toxic
Yeah.
arenas. And so that was just so fascinating. So there was no playbook for this. We were creating it on the fly. And this is how I ended up teaching, is that one day I had a professor actually at USC who was at the graduate Annenberg School. They had a master's in public diplomacy program. And they said, look, we love what you're doing. Have you ever thought about taking these lessons and all this research you have from all these companies and putting it into a course? And it's like, sure. So that was the first time I ever taught, was actually at USC, and it was a corporate diplomacy and geopolitical risk course. And so that's kind of how my teaching career got underway. And that was probably about 15 years ago.
Okay.
But then just kind of bringing everything full circle, one of the founding 7 CEOs that started that nonprofit with Keith was John McNeil. And John at the time was CEO of TBWA Shite Day down in LA. And just, again, one of those leaders that working with him at the end of every call, he'd go, are you having fun, Carrie? He's like, the minute you're not having fun, that's when you have to plan your next move, your next step. And he was just such a cool, amazing guy to work with. He had lived and worked and been CEO for a number of advertising agencies all over the world. And so he called me during the pandemic and he said, what are you up to? I'm launching this new consultancy that's all about scaling purpose and social impact, ChangeX. What do you think about joining our effort? And if he had told me he was selling hair care, I would have found a way to work for John McNeil. I mean, that's just how cool he is, right? And that's what great leaders do. He and I were just spiritually aligned from the jump. It didn't matter what it was. I was going to find a way to work with John and support what he was doing. And then through that, I've been able to, just expand kind of my work with purpose-driven leaders, which is such a cool space to occupy. Although right now it is a challenging environment because you have the economic constrictions happening, but then also the political environment. So that is the big picture, weird journey to where I am now.
Man. Yeah,
And then, yeah.
Wow. I mean, it's interesting too. You have had quite a journey. Obviously you've earned everything that you've achieved and worked very hard for it. But it's always those times in life where you're at the right place at the right time, and circumstances kind of dictate, hey, I'm going to move in this direction, right? Like you're going to the green zone, meet your husband, next thing you know, you're in California, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is though too that our lives kind of intersected a little bit. When you mentioned those names, like Powell, I didn't get to work for him, but I introduced him at a CSO conference once, and that was the kick because he's like you. I mean, I think he's the best. And the fact that you got to brief him and work with him, I think is awesome. Armitage, I remember, was doing the basis negotiations when I was in the Philippines. And so we'd see him work out at the gym, big guy. And Clark, I remember we briefed him on a Hezbollah op back when he was, at the NSC at the old EOB. So yeah, it was really interesting. Uh, just watching your journey and just seeing where you've achieved. So when you look at business and academia, is there one that you prefer, or do you like them both equally as well? I mean, how do you slice that for you?
Well, it's interesting because the whole business school that I teach with now, there's a reason I teach at Holt and only at Holt, and that's
Okay.
because Holt is very entrepreneurial. So they're all about bringing practical learnings and the business world into the classroom for everything we do. So that's part of it. And because I'm not a normal sort of professor type, if you will. Again, I bring that unguided missile with me in every class experience. So that's part of it too, is that Holt is very much wanting me to bring those projects, wanting me to bring those real world insights into the classroom. So I think that's unusual. But it also, for me, creates a laboratory because my grad students are from all over the world. So I'll have on any given year, 80 some odd nationalities. So it's a great way for me to test ideas, to see where they are. I also love looking at things through the prism of cross-generational differences because I have
Hmm.
every age range in there.
Right.
So I enjoyed them both. I'm one of the few people that always enjoyed working in the government. I mean, it was one of the most frustrating times, work wise, but that builds a certain level of perseverance. Like, you just have to figure out which lever of power to pull to get something done
Hmm.
at any level within the organization. And that foundation was huge. But I always like to say I got out of the US government before my idealism was totally crushed. Um, and
Yeah.
and it was one of those things too, because I also had the opportunity when I was in grad school to work for Senator Phil Gramm. And
Hmm.
so to see a US senator who was a Democrat who had become a Republican, he was a senior senator, very much an independent thinker.
Right.
And Powell was the same way. I mean, they were all about leading with integrity and not letting the party dictate where they fell out on any issue. And so that for me too is just, I just sort of assumed that's the way political leadership was. So I really love working with all the sectors, and then nonprofits. I mean, nonprofits to me are the one that probably pull at my heart more than anything else because
Hmm.
they're people who care so much. They're usually resource strapped. They want to do the right thing, but they just don't know how to accelerate. So I love bringing all the puzzle pieces together and going, what makes the most sense in this situation to move this forward? And
Right.
so you can pull from each of them because they each have strengths. And they also have their drawbacks as well. I would say, so Microsoft was on our board, and it was funny because we were doing some projects with Microsoft. And I remember thinking, God, working with Microsoft is like working with the State Department again, because I was meeting so many people and having to get things cleared before we could make an announcement or do anything. And it was, that's a skill set to be able to navigate all those
It
different
is.
layers.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, from a leadership perspective, I always remember people would ask me, so what was the difference between going from USG to the private sector? And it was just what you alluded to. I could you plot me in any enterprise, I'll figure it out eventually, right? Like you. But it's just figuring out like who to go to, like levers of power, right?
Mhm.
And one thing you did mention was interesting because I experienced the same thing. When I first got to Microsoft in 2002, it was much more agile company. It was smaller, obviously, still powerful, but very agile. By the time I left in 2018, it was what you were talking about, where it would take 15 years ago, 2 steps to get to an answer. I had to go to 10 steps. And then it became like the government, right? And it was like, okay, probably time to pull stakes.
Yeah.
The other thing is that you had a lot of really defining leadership experiences, a lot of pressure early on in your career.
Mhm.
And I think this is something that touches. I just did a thought piece for a security magazine, and one of the things I talk about, and I've talked about before, is the imposter syndrome, right?
Mhm.
Where, and not everybody has, but I certainly had it at the periods of my time where, even though I was wherever I was, do I actually deserve to be here, and am I good enough?
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
have you ever faced anything like that, or were you just always confident and just knew yourself well enough that okay, I'm 21 years old and I got to brief Powell or whatever I got to do, I can nail this.
I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. I certainly
Okay,
come from a long line of amazing, confident storytellers and salespeople. I mean, my dad, like, he was in sales at tech sales at EDS after he got out of the Marine Corps, and his
okay,
brothers, all the family, whenever they would get together, I mean, they were just great storytellers. And what I've come to appreciate is that, all of this, all influence and persuasion comes down to great storytelling. So that was kind of
yeah.
part of my foundation. And to be heard in my family, you had to be confident in what you had to say, and you had to be entertaining because there was a lot of alcohol involved. And so that's part of it,
Uh,
right?
yeah.
And they were also always paying attention to what was happening in the world, which I so value
Okay.
because, and I bring that value with my kids, like paying attention to what's happening in the world and developing your own point of view, not letting the
Mhm.
media do it for you. So what do you think about this? And why do you care about it? Um, there were numerous points in my career where I felt totally overwhelmed, totally unqualified. And then I would have a senior leader. And here again is where I think mentors and sponsors, but I never called them that at the time. But like
Sure.
Keith would say things. He would be like, well, you could be CEO of D2B one day. Why not? Like, I was like, did he just say that? So I would have different leaders go, well, of course you can do this. Why not? And it just never even, and I guess because I was put in the room so many different times
Hmm.
with these senior leaders that you just get used to them, and they just want to be treated like any other individual. Just be straight with us. Just tell us what you got and then what we can do, and let's move forward. Right. So appreciating their time and valuing that.
Hmm.
But I've also realized that I think probably the most formative career experiences I've had have been because I've been willing to take the risk and take the jump.
Yep.
Knowing that,
Yep.
yeah, I may not be qualified, but there's a phrase you use that I love. You need that. We need this t-shirt. I'll figure it out. And I think that more than anything is the skill set that, at least with my students, I want to try and influence in the next generation of leaders. It's
Hmm.
why I love working with entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurs are very much that way. We'll figure it out. And once you realize that, that sort of frees you up to go, you know what? Everything I need to be successful is already within me.
Right.
I just need to find the right ways of making this happen. And so for years, I was trying to figure out, what do I call this skill set too, that I was sharing with you, kind of the finding the different levers of power, building alliances both around you, but also externally, all of this. And so that was the course that I just launched and co-taught this summer, actually a few weeks ago,
Mhm.
with a colleague of mine who's an organizational psychologist, Ali Fenwick in Dubai. But it's political intelligence at work. And it's all about navigating formal and informal power structures of the power force field, but also neutralizing toxicity, because that's,
Mhm.
and so we actually developed the tool sets within that, because that's what I was trying to crystallize, that I'll figure it out piece. So that we could teach it, because it's a really hard thing for people to get their mind around. It's kind of like saying we want you to be resilient. What does
Right.
that mean? Right.
Yeah.
And especially if you come from a culture that's very hierarchical, the idea of navigating, like, I love to bring in a lot of military and intelligence strategies, because I was able to go to some of the best hacking schools when I was in DS that the CIA at the time and also NSA were running. And so bringing those strategies into how you develop strategic alliances to support your overall objectives, that was something I was methodical about. And it was always so that we could not only get the mission accomplished and the job done, but then I had leaders around me going, you need to be thinking 5, 10 years from now. Where do you want to be? And had they not planted those seeds in me early enough, I don't think I would have taken the risks that I took early on. But they were like, to get to that point 10 years from now, you have to be able to take those risks. And just always use the phrase, why not? So the minute that starts creeping in, that doubt, just go, why not?
Why
Like,
not?
why not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You were, you were really fortunate to be in an area of the government where risk, taking risk was basically part of the job, right? I mean, you had to do it. There are other parts of the USG that, as we all know, very risk averse, takes forever to make a
Mhm.
decision, blah, 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 blah. Not that it was perfect in BS or the intelligence community, but in order to hit the objective, you had to take a certain amount of risk. And you had to look, as you said, think 5 years ahead, think downrange and see what the ramifications, the ripple effect of whatever you're doing now. So I think that was very important. You mentioned something. I don't delve into politics much in this podcast, but it's interesting that you mentioned we mentioned Philip Graham, how he went from Democrat to Republican, but obviously a very independent mindset, as you said. There's so much toxicity, right, between the parties. There's one gentleman that just threw his hat in the ring, Will Hurd, and Janice and I actually got to know Will very well. He was with CIA, different generation. I like to say I was Kirk, and he was probably next generation, right?
Mhm.
But he's out at San Antonio. But he just threw his hat in the ring. But I remember he's one of those ones that always crossed the party line. He went across country with Beto O'Rourke, and he did a YouTube thing, and they were hitting honky tonks. that could debate, just like Reagan and Tip O'Neill could debate back in the
Mhm.
day without hating each other, right?
Mhm.
And now it's just become this thing where if you're on one party or the other, you actually dislike each other, let alone policy issues, you know. This must come up in your classes, right? You know, and so uh, just walk me through that as you talk to those subjects. What are the students thinking? I mean, what are their ideas about how to fix this thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those areas where, so I had a client recently, she's a head of HR for this large financial institution, and she's like, we don't
Mhm.
talk about politics. We're in HR, and we don't talk about religion either. And to not be able to talk about these aspects of our lives, first of all, it just doesn't make sense because it is affecting the business. We're all curious and want to learn more. So I actually invite the conversation.
Mhm.
And with my students, it's not just dealing with the dysfunctionality and having a discussion about the dysfunction of US politics. We could be talking about leadership in Brazil. Yeah.
Sure.
Or what's happening with Russia and the Ukraine. So, and this year I had more students from Russia than I've ever had before. So it was so much fun. But I think
Yeah,
of
interesting.
that as an opportunity to go, okay,
Yeah.
how do we bridge understanding? So the first thing is that you have to prepare people for the discussion. So anytime I facilitate something on corporate diplomacy or geopolitical risk, or even
Mhm.
political intelligence, when we're looking at it outside the organization, I'll give them briefing papers, just like we would for any senior official, right? And I'll say, I just want you to review some of these different thought pieces. And very much the thought pieces are research data driven, but also from thought leaders that I respect and trust for, trying to be as neutral as possible. And then when I bring everybody together, it's how do you facilitate that in a way that doesn't quickly become polarized and personal attacks? Because in business school, whenever I want them to not have an aversion to conflict, I want them to welcome
Right.
conflict, but be able to manage it because that's where innovation emerges. That's where the best divergent thinking comes forward. But you got to be careful because quickly politics can turn personal and people get defensive. And so it's totally reframing the mindset around fear and aversion to getting
Mhm.
towards this place of curiosity. And so I have to be really delicate in how I do that. But I've done it so often and for so long. And in every class that I'm in, I actually insert it and tee it up. And then after they've done this a few times, then they learn how to do it themselves. So I equip them with the tools to do it because when they go out into the world in their organizations, I want them to be able to step in and neutralize toxicity if they do see it going, or even in their families at Thanksgiving dinner. I want them to be able to go, this is not productive, right?
Yeah.
But how can we get back to what are we actually disagreeing about? Because I see someone disagreeing with me as a point of respect. If they didn't respect me enough to want to give me their time and energy, they could just be apathetic and just sort of disengage. And I think we have too much of that going on, way too
Hmm.
much of that. And I
I
think we
like that.
need
Hmm.
we need more citizens equipped and empowered to be part of the conversation and to really make thoughtful, informed decisions. And so when you start unpacking what are we actually even disagreeing about, that then calms everything down. And there are a number of it would be so fun to bring you into I have to bring you back into the classroom, of course, but
I love to.
so the agency, as you know, and just intelligence and law enforcement has a fascinating approach to influence and persuasion. And the way it's unpacked is so nuanced and detailed. We don't get the luxury of doing that the same way in business school. That's why I so deeply appreciate the skill sets of security officers, especially those who go into business after they've been in the federal government. But there are certain ways of leveraging language and even your nonverbals
Mhm.
that can shift behavior, but it's a very nuanced science-backed process. And so I sneak as much of that in on them as possible because in cross-cultural dynamics, it's essential. Now, the other thing
Right.
too about all this is going, where is the line crossed for me? And when that happens, as individuals of principle and integrity, to be able to go, it's not worth I feel that my values are being threatened, or this is not worth my time and energy. So how do I exit this situation as gracefully as possible so that I can maintain the relationship, but I just realize I'm not going to let it go any deeper. So it's a constant sort of building of that situational awareness too, which is another skill set I know you deeply appreciate too. It's like at a
Yeah.
certain point, we have to separate too and detach from the emotion and go, what do I want out of this relationship? And how much more am I willing to invest in this? And look, there are people even in my own family who they've completely bought into certain ideologies, and there's no point in me expending any more energy having the argument with them.
Yeah.
However, what I have found about, Gen Z, and a lot of my students, I would say, are Gen Z, Gen X, but I've also done some classes, some like mini classes for fun with Gen Alpha, because they're teenagers this year. And I'm fascinated by how different they view the world and how engaged and excited they are to pay attention to the world, to want to be informed about the world. And I just want to continue supporting and encouraging that. I don't want to shut it down and say that when you go to work, you can't talk about this, but it's kind of like, after 9/11 in the West, we dramatically moved away from the Middle East and the Muslim world. And if you sit people down, like I do, every time I would take executives to the Middle East, the first thing we would do is I would take them to a mosque with an Islamic scholar, and we would sit down on the floor and I would go, ask any question. And that immediately would diffuse all the tension and everybody was allowed to share. And then you start looking for, okay, where do we have common interests? And it was amazing, because that moment, then you go, wait a second, that's not what the media is saying. This is so different than what and business is all about bridging understanding and finding a way forward, very different than counterterrorism work.
Yeah. No, you're spot on. Everything you said, I love that, taking the executives to the mosque. I think that was great. When I was at Microsoft, I remember we did a swing through Israel,
Mm.
and I had a person there, a team there, and I remember going to Jerusalem because there's, as you know, USG has two kind of entities, one in Tel Aviv with the Israelis and one in Jerusalem to take care of the Palestinian issue. We met with like 4 or 5 Palestinian business people. And again, you know, it was eye-opening.
Mm.
They wanted engagement. They didn't want the rockets flying in either direction. They wanted some pathway to peace, and it was very interesting to see that.
Mm.
One thing that just struck me, and it was interesting you mentioned that. So you've created a situation in your classes where people are encouraged uh, to have debate, rigorous debate, in a respectful manner, passionate, right, without getting personal, and figure that's a balancing act. There's a narrative, right, going around that in most college campuses, a generation of students are shutting down any kind of speech, especially if it's coming from conservative voices, which is not healthy, obviously, if that were true. So, what's your take on that? You're in that world.
Mm.
You're not seeing it in whole, at least in your class, but
Mm.
is that narrative true? What's your take on this?
I think a lot of it has been blown out of proportion, but it also, one of my favorite phrases when it comes to global business is it depends. It depends on the environment and the situation. And, I see my role as an educator is to be neutral and not have a point of view. So my students have no idea what my political affiliation is or how I vote ever,
Yep.
because it's not about me. It's about them developing their own point of views. Now that doesn't
You're
mean I
you're
don't
like a
have my
Walter
opinions.
Cronkite, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm Switzerland. I have to be Switzerland. And yet there are moments where even within business leadership, where I will call out unethical behavior. Like I just have no
Hmm.
patience for that. And I get really upset when I see leaders of every political stripe not honoring the power position that they're in. That really
Right.
gets me going. Right. And so, but again, I have to, in the classroom, it's not about my personal point of view. And I also too, so I teach, so Holt is a fascinating university on a number of levels. It was started as a grad school first and then added a global undergrad program. It's to graduate. So it's similar to Thunderbird in that you rotate to global
Hmm.
campuses. So you get that experience. But one of the first classes I was asked to teach for Holt was actually in gender, and it was a women's leadership course. And I remember the dean of the Dubai campus saying, well, I want you to teach this. And I said, why? I'm not engaged in the gender space at all. He's like, well, you're a woman, so there you go. Yeah. I was like,
Okay.
okay, but if I'm
Yeah.
going to do this, then I have two conditions. One, men have to be in the room. And two, it has to be practical, like ways
Mm.
that we can find to kind of get through some of the blind spots we have at work. How do we communicate more effectively, understand one another more effectively? You know, I'm not going to get into platitudes about gender theory. Like that's just not, you know, and this was 10 years ago, we started that work in Dubai, and it's just continued to grow. And then you had the Me Too movement. And then now look at what's happening in the gender space. It has become politically toxic. You have extremes on every side now. Similar to what happened with Me Too, like just things get taken so far, and then you're going to have people want to fight that. And in business, we just don't have time for that. You
Yeah.
know, and it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, okay, but that doesn't mean we don't listen to different points of view. So with my gender intelligence graduate elective, I bring in different points of view. I have friends who are trans, who are leading in different communities within industry, and my students see the minute they come in is they're there to talk about business and to give a
Hmm.
window into, you know, some of the challenges they faced, but to not come in and be an activist. That's not their role when I invite them into the classroom. Now, they'll certainly answer any questions, and some of them have answered deeply personal questions. It's why I don't allow anyone to record our classroom conversations, because I want people to feel free to share and to
Sure.
be vulnerable and to speak from the heart, because that's, to me, the true essence of leadership, when you're able to show up as you are, to take the mask off, which is what I always invite my students to do. It's like, take that mask off and be willing to just come as you. And for a lot of them, that's the first time they've ever been invited to do that, to put aside every expectation, their family, their current roles, their, you know,
Hmm.
their community has on them, and to just go, I just want to engage in this space from a place of curiosity. And so within even the gender intelligence space, you know, they then left the class, first of all, equipped with some better tools for understanding one another, and also the gender spectrum, which, you know, gender, the landscape of how we even talk about it. Gen Alpha does see gender very differently.
Hmm.
Gen Alpha is going to be our future consumers. We have to be not only our future consumers, but our employees. We have to recognize where they are and meet them where they are. And then be able to go, okay, so what can we do from a business perspective? What, you know, because we're not, and some leaders want to take this on full stock, and by all means, you know, there's that space for you. But most companies just want to find a way to, you know, make sure that they're listening to their customers and meeting a customer need, but also make sure that they're recruiting and retaining the best talent, which is increasingly a challenge. So how do they do that in a thoughtful way? And gender is a part of that, because gender is a part of how we see the world. It's a part of how we engage with the world. So I just want students to come out of my class, or anything that I facilitate, even when I do a lot of board, you know, like master classes and things like that with senior leaders. I just want them to come away equipped with some tools, but also be curious. Because I think when we're curious, then we're going to be taking in different points of view, and to question where we get a lot of our informational capital. Because I think too often we're, you know, we just don't have a lot of time, and we get it from one single source, as
Right.
opposed to broadening our sources. And when I was at State, I had two televisions in my office that were running Al
Mm.
Jazeera, every single feed, you know, you could imagine. And I've always, you know, watched Fox News and CNN and MSNBC, as well as, you know, a host of other media, because I need to hear what each of these perspectives are saying, because I'm going to get asked about it.
Right.
So if you don't listen to all of these different inputs, then how can you develop your own point of view? You can't. So I'm all about as many
Hmm.
diverse inputs as possible. I feel sad when I see a professor canceled because a professor gave a bad grade. Like that really
Right.
infuriates me, because
Right.
you know, it's like your marks are what your marks are. And, um,
Yeah.
you know, but
Yeah.
also
Or
too,
they
I
bring
mean,
him in, or like that, what was it? The law professor came in, he was conservative and he was shouted down,
uh-huh.
or whatever. But you actually answered the question I was going to ask. Like, how do you personally get these different inputs? So you just answered that question. So you do take the time to look at all the different CNN, BBC, MSNBC, Fox,
Oh.
just to see what they're saying, right?
And I read, Mike, that's the other thing. I mean, I listen to media, but more than anything, I read, and I have a whole collection of journalists that I follow and respect because I know that they adhere to journalistic principles, which is increasingly rare, but they'll triple source everything. So that's the other thing. It's like questioning the data source, questioning,
Right.
who is actually producing, anything that you're taking in. And then I read a ton. And I think oftentimes too, that's a challenge for anyone. If
Mhm.
this is not your nerdy space, if you don't love geopolitical risk, for
Right.
example, you're not going to be, it's like, you're not going to be paying attention to absolutely everything in the world. But what you can do is develop social capital with colleagues and friends that you respect and trust that are following it. For example, like Ukraine and Russia, that's the one part of the world I've not lived and worked in, but I have a ton of friends that do and are managing businesses that are dealing with the blowback of that every single day. So I call them, like I engage my social capital and leverage that for the insights I need. And then they'll go, okay, well, here's some further sources that we trust. And so I look not only, for my students, I call it the 3 T's of informational capital, but it's the traction. We have to pay attention to what's happening day to day, right? What's going to be top line. But then beyond that, what are the signals that we're hearing, the trends, the signals that start clustering into trends? Because that from a business perspective is really, because I do strategy work, that's where we need to be honing in and spending more time on, because that ultimately is going to impact our decision making, as
Right.
opposed to letting the traction be our trigger for decisions. That never works out well unless you're in an intense acute crisis. And then the third thing is, over time, as you start really tracking and monitoring trends, you start to notice tendencies and behavior of senior leaders that you can anticipate how they might react and behave. Now, some leaders will never be able to anticipate, like Elon Musk. Who knows? It's a gamble.
Yeah.
But most humans,
Yeah.
we have patterns
Yeah.
of behavior, and even markets too. And this is how, I have a number of risk modeling approaches, but you're able to kind of take a number of data points and go, from all the intelligence we have, this is what we think it's going to do. So where's the opportunity for business? And this is why I'm so fascinated by the intersection of leadership and crisis, because I find crisis moments, Mike, as an opportunity to drive change and
Oh
real
yeah.
social impact. But it's often a window of time where we're all just in reaction mode and we can't think strategically because we can't get out of that sort of fight or flight
Yep.
reactionary position.
Yeah. You've got to be able to take a step back. There's so much to dissect here, which you just said. First, look the sources of information that you look at. Would you share that with me personally? Because I'd like to.
Of course, just for you though.
Just for me. Yeah.
Someday,
I'm not.
Mike, I wanna have a company that I call the Wisdom Distillery. That's literally every piece of wisdom I've curated from around the world in like one spot, but in different buckets, because there's so many different elements of.
Yeah. No. Just with me and for the audience. Well, you'll glean
I
what she's
will.
given to me through.
I'll give you my
Yeah.
top five. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But it's interesting when oh man, you talked about the crisis situations. I was watching a podcast with Jocko Willink
Yeah.
not too long ago, right? And so he talked about as a baby SEAL going into a close quarters battle scenario, training, and observers were watching, senior SEALs, and they were stacked up ready to go, and whoever his leader wasn't doing anything, right? And he said, oh man, should I make this decision? And the leader was probably right, as you were talking about, focused so much on the stuff he couldn't unask himself from the situation. Jocko finally thought to himself, okay, I might get in trouble for this, but he said basically, hold left, you two go stack right, oh, go right. And then the seniors apparently above told him afterwards, hey, that was a good decision, young man. But he learned a lesson about in the middle of this bad situation, being able to take yourself 2 steps back so you can get a bigger picture, so you're not the tunnel vision. And that's exactly what you were talking about, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that's emotional agility too, to be able to again detach from the emotion in the moment. Because so I'm fascinated by the neuroscience behind
Hmm.
how we react and behave in um, not just acute crisis moments, but also extended crisis moments and uncertainty, like what we had with COVID. And so that's exactly it. I mean, that's why crisis is such a crucible for leaders. That's where you see leaders emerge out of nowhere. The ones that are able to detach and to see the broader force field and go, wait, before we do this. Now what's challenging about this, so Powell was very much that way. And everybody around you, and especially Americans, we just have a disproportionate need to act. And so I always am reminded of, my dad taught me this when I was like 5 or 6 years old, with the OODA loop that fighter pilots leverage, right? Observe, orient, decide, act in a combat situation. Observe, orient are the two most critical pieces of the OODA loop. But Americans are all about, we decide, we act. And that's what we've been taught. And that's what strength looks like. And so I've had the great fortune of being able to work with Mark Devine, who started a Navy SEAL, but former commander, who started the Unbeatable Mind Academy. Part of the reason why I was drawn to Mark's work and with SEAL Fit is because I thought those resiliency tactics and strategies, which a lot of his too draws from his wealth of experience in martial arts, I wanted to make that available to women, because I was, doing a number of women's leadership efforts, and the SEALs, they have a lot of men who naturally gravitate towards them because of their experience and all of that. But I not only thought about women, but I thought about kids learning these skill sets. And I was like, Mark, in my dream, someday we'll have the Unbeatable Mind Academy for like my kids. But the thing about working with Mark, and I actually have Jocko's kids book, which is awesome.
Oh, right,
The warrior kid and all that.
Yeah.
And even with you, is that people, and this is what people, and a lot of the senior executives I work with in business, if you're not around seasoned security people, sometimes you don't have as deep of appreciation of this. But what I've noticed is you're some of the calmest people I've ever met. You just are like, And it's that calming energy in any room that I so value. That's why I really, anytime I work with a senior, like a CEO or a chairman, I'll ask about the chief security officer. And if they're in the C, like, are they actually in the C? Do you bring them in at a strategic level? Because that signals to me, a deeper appreciation on a number of levels. But great security people, they just are so calm, and they're able to detach, not get drawn in and engulfed by the emotion. And then they also have a number of strategies to redirect that fight or flight response. So when that amygdala does get hijacked, it's like, how do we calm not only ourselves, but everyone on our team, so that way we can be most effective? And so that's, especially during the pandemic, that's when I really started working a lot with Mark and his team. And so I'm part of their academy to be one of their coaches, and to help the people that are developing their coaching in that space, because I just don't think we have enough of that. And I think there's too much this sort of, and especially in business, when you have an economic retraction like we're having right now, you have a lot of snap decisions that you were mentioning, the cascade effects, just especially if you just look at layoffs, like here in Silicon Valley, it's like, seriously, like it took months for some of my friends to get hired at some of these tech companies. And then the layoffs happen, and it's just like no relationship management. It's just not smart. And I'm like, what is going on? And that to me signals panic. It signals we haven't really thought this through. We're just trying, and I just do not admire at all. And that should make, these organizations rethink. I don't know that they're going to do that, but it's a fascinating time for companies because they also have a talent shortage at the same time. So it's like,
I mean, Microsoft, gone through rounds of layoffs too. But exactly to your point, I had a friend of mine been working there for 15 years or whatever it was told to come to a Teams meeting, and that's how they were told, right?
oh God.
So yeah, right. That's how they were told. And so you have on the one hand the C-suite maybe saying, "Hey, we value you as employees and blah 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 blah." But when the rubber meets the road, you can't find a better way to divest yourself if you have to, if financially that makes sense. I mean, it's all about ultimately it's all about P&Ls, but there's a way to do it humanely. And so it also, at the same time, when you're doing this, now you've broken the trust, right? They don't trust you. And so there's a morale issue
Yeah.
going on at Microsoft, for instance, right now. They took a poll, and a lot of people said if they could find another job, they'd leave, right? And that's terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's hopefully they'll learn from you, and just be able to extrapolate what you have, just push it out around the world, politics and in business.
Well, what's
Um,
funny though, Micah, so with this course, it was really fascinating because my counterpart, Ali Fenwick, so he's so awesome. He actually just got a book deal because he's a relationship, like he specializes in relationships, and organizational management is his background, and psychology, and so he's all over TikTok and all. He's never going to get me on
mhm.
TikTok. It's just not going to happen. But one of the things that we found out with this course is that we've tested it off of alumni. So we both had alumni sessions, and on average, so I did one in New York, I did one in San Francisco. These are people who've been out post grad like 10 years. So they're right at the point where they're going to start ascending into leadership. And they took this course, the graduate elective, but then also these alumni sessions because they trusted us. But from the jump, they said, we hate politics. The word politics, we don't want to do it. We don't understand the intersection with business, any of that, right? And then by the time we got finished with the course, they were like, why isn't this taught to everybody?
Mhm.
Because the reality is that to get to a senior leadership position, to get to a position of power, which I think we need more leaders with integrity in positions of power, you
Yeah.
have to have the tools and the skill set and the mindset that you're going to navigate that force field. And you're going to deal with toxicity along the way, especially the further up you get. And so how you navigate that is everything. And women are fascinating because women are like, look, and a lot of senior women will say, I'm tired of the bullshit. And they exit right at the point where you're like, that's where organizations
Yeah.
should be holding on to that great talent. But Microsoft, like all of these huge global companies, they've been grooming these leaders for years, but then at a certain point they all leave because they don't want to deal with that force field.
Yep.
And so to get that mindset shift and to rethink that maybe political intelligence is about how do we navigate, it's really all about power and the psychology of power. And so one of the things I had them do, which was really fun, which I think you would have loved this, but I have a core 4 personal management inventory, which I make them go deep. And it's a lot of, reevaluating your values, your strengths, but also your purpose and crystallizing that. And capturing your war stories and being able to share those stories and those lessons. So I had them reflecting back to their time in grad school, but then I had them reflecting forward. And those were exercises that I explored at the Institute for the Future, but also, Unbeatable Mind does this, but and Andrew
Mhm.
Huberman at Stanford. So
Yep.
his work on visualization. So it's fascinating leveraging visualization in this sphere, because again, it allows us to think 10 years, a minimum 10 years out, and what that ideal leadership might look and feel like, and where you want to lead and drive impact. And there's just so little opportunities for any of us to think that way anymore.
Yeah.
We're just never invited to do that. And especially the further you go in life, you have kids, you have families, you have partners, you have responsibilities. So the
Yeah. It's hard to
idea,
step back and yeah, it's hard to find time.
right? But the thing is if you learn the skill sets, like great visualization that a lot of professional athletes use, I mean, the
Mhm.
ideal visualization practice is like 20, 30 seconds,
Yeah.
but it's unlocking our imaginal intelligence. So this is the other thing that I've seen in the last year in particular, is this reemergence and appreciation. Maybe it's because of the ascendancy of AI and just there's so much concern about AI's predominance, but the power of the creative mind and our imaginal intelligence, and how do we better access and unpack that. And so Ivy Ross's work at Google, I don't know if you've read her book.
Mhm.
Oh, it's like one of my absolute, I even have it, Your Brain on Art.
Okay.
But
Write
she
that
unpacks
down.
the neuroscience behind art. So she runs hardware development at Google.
Okay.
And she's
Oh, okay.
she's an alchemist. She's a jewelry designer who used titanium to unlock a new color spectrum. But anyway, she talks about how art is one of the, it's the universal global language, and how so often we're taught by age, 8 or 9, if you don't have some gift, you aren't labeled a creative. And so no
Mm.
more art for you. You don't need any more art. But the
No more soup
power,
for you.
No more. Yeah. Like, oh, but even in like business, the creatives are usually sequestered. They're not the ones in there with senior leadership because they can be messy to work with. But I think they're some
Mm.
of the coolest people, right? Because they're able to make these very unusual connections and bring forward different insights in a compelling way. So in my classes, one of the things I've been really intentional too is how can I help these future business leaders unlock more of their imaginal intelligence, and be invited to do so. So one of the guest lecturers I had was, for the political intelligence course, is Blaise Bertrand, who was a senior partner at IDEO, also ran innovation at Google and Meta. And he brought in this whole notion of, he even developed a new term. He was calling it creatalytics. So like creativity and politics together, right? But it was this idea of, we have to be thinking creatively about our own leadership trajectory and how we bring that forward. And for him, the purpose, he's a purpose-driven leader. So his purpose and what he wants to drive, his values, that is consistent no matter what organization he goes into. And he said, in every organization, you're going to have that resistance because these organizations are living organisms. They're structures and systems that you have to find a way to navigate, and neutralize. And I think it's really, really challenging for a lot of people because there's so much emphasis on remote work now. So you don't get to meet people one-to-one and
Oh
have
yeah,
that
yeah.
connection. Like, I can't imagine my early career on Zoom. Like, it just wouldn't have
No,
been, can you? I mean,
no, it wouldn't have worked.
no.
No. You said the why nots and the navigate. You mentioned navigate a lot throughout this podcast, and
Mm,
like you can't navigate remotely. It's not effective.
no.
It just
Yeah.
doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Mhm.
And yeah, those skills that you learned at an early age in the government continues to help you navigate, right?
Mhm.
There's actually a person I need to introduce you to. She's going to be on a future podcast. Do you know Kristen Willimer?
Name sounds so familiar, but I don't
She's a
think so.
neuroscientist, and she wrote a book that I really got hooked on. And it's really basically about how the brain functions. And she's worked a lot with athletes,
Mm.
and getting them back into neurological health. And she still obviously does a lot of litigation work. But I'm going to connect the two of you together because I can see an intersection between the two of you, right? Your work and her work, and you can both complement each other. So I'll make sure I connect the dots.
Oh, I would
Um,
love that. Yeah.
yeah. So that's great. So I'm gonna have to probably wrap this up because I could do this with you forever because this is fun, because it's not just leaders. We've delved into all these different topics, but I always ask the question at the end. So, and I think I know the answer most 9 times out of 10, but you look at everything going on in the world, the political discourse and the economic issues and this and that and the other thing. But you are in a unique position because you're in business for a year in academia, and you've actually been able to meld the both of them very effectively so that one complements the other. But as you look at the students that you have now and the ones that are coming downrange, uh, you know, are you hopeful that whatever is going on in today's world, whether it's in corporations or whether it's politics, that this next generation will be able to? Nothing's ever going to be hunky-dory and perfect, but are we going to see improvement in political discourse, in just human discourse in the next 10, 15, 20 years with what you're seeing coming, into the pipeline?
I mean, I'm always the optimist. It's why I don't think I could do what I do if I wasn't naturally an optimist and believing in the fundamental core nature of humans. I think we're more alike than we are
Hmm.
dissimilar. And I think
Yep,
once we
yep.
come together in person, you feel that and see that. And I've spent so much of my life outside of the United States that you realize we all just want a lot of very basic, simple things in life. And if you get down to that core, I think we can overcome almost anything. And when we stop paying attention, when we allow um, leaders in politics in particular, in official government positions to do the thinking for us, that's when it becomes very dangerous. When we allow machines to
Right.
do the thinking for us, it becomes very dangerous. I look at AI and I see the opportunity there, and I see how it's going to make us more efficient and potentially more creative and more productive. But I also am concerned when I see 110 million people sign up for Threads. We don't need another social media app,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
signals that we need connection. And instead, we're defaulting our need for connection with other human beings, which is a very primal need, to technology, instead of really going, look, we have control over the technology, at least for now we do. And so it's when we abdicate our own power to technology, to leaders that don't have integrity, that we just stop thinking. And I think you saw a lot of that happening during COVID, in part because I think we were just all genuinely scared and there was so much uncertainty. But coming out of that, my hope is that we have more business schools, more companies willing to invite conversations, uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm encouraged when I see people like you leading and writing down these lessons, and wanting to share what they've learned. I mean, it's like Mark. Mark is getting his doctorate in leadership. I'm starting my doctorate in leadership and crisis actually in January. And I'm
Oh
doing
man.
it, yeah, because I want to find a way of getting more of these lessons and wisdom to other people so they can use, because I just recognize just how rare it is to be exposed to the great leaders that I've had the privilege of working with. So I am optimistic on one level, but I'm also really concerned on another level. And I think it just means we need greater vigilance and the responsibility on the individual, especially those of us who are leading in our communities, who are leading in our families, and anybody who touches the next generation or is in an influence position with the next generation, to encourage them to be critical thinkers, to be curious about the world and pay attention. Because we used to be good at that in the West, and now we
Yeah.
suck at it because everything was at the expense of everything has to be STEM. And we're not creating critical thinkers anymore. And that's
Right.
really, really sad. And so every part of me, whether it's part of my job or not, as a parent, as someone in my community, I'm inviting these conversations, I'm sharing resources, and so that kind of urgency that I have around all of us as citizens, that's what I want to try and encourage, because I think, especially when you look at AI and how rapidly it's advancing, that means the onus on us to pay attention and to be more engaged. And, it goes up exponentially. And I want more leaders to lead. I just don't think
Yeah.
we have enough leaders who are willing to be courageous and to say what they think and to step out for fear of being canceled or being labeled. And it's like, no, I mean, we need more thought leadership. We need more thought leadership from diverse voices and leaders in every realm, because I think we have too many dominant voices that are not bringing us together. So,
Yeah. Amen to that. No, I agree 100%. And sometimes big changes happen in small steps, and so, each of us in our own individual environments and ecosystems can hopefully make the kind of change that eventually ripples of, it'll take time, but I agree with you. If we used to be great critical thinkers, but yes, you said we suck at it now, but there's always hope, right? So, uh,
you just keep moving forward, right? And my
yeah,
mantra, so I share this with my students at the end of every class, but the mantra that I say with my kids every night is be grateful, be great, help others, and finish strong. And finishing strong means, and again, this is something we in the West, and I think Americans in particular, we suck at, but it means really taking a moment of reflection to go, what have I learned from this point in time? And what do I want to take forward, or what do I want to do differently going forward? Because, like I always say, if there isn't at least one thing you're willing to consider doing differently after one of my sessions, then we've wasted our time together. But that
right.
reflection, that constant reflection, and just, and from a neuroscience perspective, that's everything, right? It's like retraining ourselves to quiet the mind, to go inward, to be reflective, and then we move on to the next thing. So finishing strong.
Good.
Gotta do it.
And as you said, why not? Right?
Why not? Yeah.
Why not? Well, thanks very much, Kari, for this session. I mean, I said we could go on forever. It's just fun to talk to you and listen to you and to, kind of go through all kinds of different topics. Ultimately, all comes down to leadership, and I appreciate your leadership and how you're imparting uh, your not just your thoughts, but you're creating an ecosystem, a milieu where people feel free to debate and and learn, and then figure out for themselves, what it's going to look like for them. And I think that's what academia, that's what life, that's what business, that's what leadership is all about. So thanks so much for taking time out of your day, and I hope you enjoy your wonderful, well-earned vacation next month.
Thank you so much, dear. It's been so much fun being with you. I can't wait to have you come guest lecture again. And I so appreciate all of your books and having the podcast and how much of your wisdom you're willing to share. And I definitely owe you some chocolate, but I'm not going to send it while it's 115 degrees out there because it'll just be a puddle of
It'll
grossness.
just be a puddle. Yeah, we'll wait till it gets a little cooler, or
Yeah.
I'll come out and we'll get the chocolate in person.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you, dear.
You're welcome. Sounds good too. Well, that's it for this edition of the Ronin Leadership Podcast. Continue to hit the subscribe button and the like button. Please, again, tell your friends and family and others about the podcast. I've got 3 books out there. I'm now delving more into fiction, so please pick up a copy of Full Circle, my latest book. And thanks again for all the support. Please continue to give me as much feedback as you have been giving me. It just makes this podcast better, helps make me better. And until next time, we'll talk to you soon.